Hello and welcome to Talking Till Dawn, the true horror podcast that delves deep into the strange, the mysterious, and the outright terrifying. I'm Michael Whitehouse, but you can call me Mike. My usual partner in crime, Mr. Martin Yates, isn't with us here tonight. In fact, he'll be stepping back a little from the podcast for a while due to his busy schedule. But fear not, he will return. For the foreseeable future, whenever Martin and I can't make a recording of the podcast together, I'll be flying solo, and sometimes having a guest host or two, such as Callum from Ghastly Tales, and there might be the occasional interview as well with other true horror investigators, carrying their own torches out there in the bleak night. Moving forward, we'll also be putting out some shorter episodes in between our usual long-form ones. That way we can talk together far more often. Thanks to everyone for their patience, and a huge thank you to our Patreon contributors who have been so kind and supportive while we figured out how best to get the podcast out there to you all again. I can't thank our patrons enough, and if you want to join our merry little band of true horror investigators over there, links will be in the show notes below, or simply visit patreon.com/talkingtilldawn. Sit back then, grab your favourite drink, lock all the doors and windows, and let's delve into this episode's case. I'm excited for this one as it involves one of my favourite all-time cryptid topics, the dreaded werewolf. When I was a kid, I used to watch films like American Werewolf in London, The Howling, and The Wolfman with equal parts fascination and terror. Yes, I watched them far too young. The idea of a curse or disease inside of you, threatening to alter your appearance and behaviour as the full moon rose, was a frightening proposition for me in my more speculative moments. It still is. And I even had a recurring dream about the creature from American Werewolf in London paying me a little visit in the night. Not an enjoyable one, ladies and gentlemen. This interest in fictionalised werewolf stories sparked a lifelong fascination with werewolfery, and I've had to ask myself, is it possible? Could there be a real werewolf out there? Do the stories come from something that actually happened? Perhaps true events that have become obscured and twisted by the passage of time? This topic is too broad for one episode, with so many fascinating cases of alleged werewolf activity to explore. I'm sure we'll get to many of those in future episodes. But let's start then with a single prominent case from the European mainland. I should warn at this juncture that, as with our exploration of the Paisley Witches documents, this case deals with similar subject matter of persecution, torture, and murder. And so if you'd rather not listen to such topics, please feel free to skip to another episode. As I always say here at Talking Till Dawn, there's no shame in stepping away from accounts that will distress you. I do this myself from time to time, so I completely understand. If you're still with me then, let's head deep into the case of Peter Stump, the werewolf of Bedburg. In the year 1562, pamphlets were invented. If that isn't an exciting opener to this, I don't know what is. But it will become relevant, as one of the main sources for this werewolf case comes from just such a pamphlet. These pamphlets tended to be just a few pages long and were used to record events of interest. They can be seen as the forerunners of the modern newspaper. It wasn't long before sensationalism took hold of this medium, exaggerating events and leaning into over-the-top stories that would hook the reader and sometimes promote misinformation. So not too dissimilar from today's news cycle then. Pamphlets also captured the feeling of the times, and even though some events were contorted to be more palatable to an eager readership, falling victim to popular bias and superstition, many of the recorded events in those pamphlets had some form of truth at their core. They came from somewhere. Something actually happened that moved the writers and publishers of those pamphlets to take action and spread the word. Just as newspapers report and pull apart stories of serial killers, war and catastrophe, the pamphlets of the late 1500s did so with concerns of their time. And two concerns which were ever-present threats to the peoples of Europe were witchcraft and the reported dangers of wolf attacks. It's not surprising then that Some of these pamphlets focused in on both of these topics, and in more than one case brought them together to suggest that a malevolent supernatural force was behind some violent wolf attacks. That some wolf attacks were, in fact, the result of shape-shifting humans able to take on the appearance of a wolf in order to sate their lust for blood. Now, whenever we discuss wolves and their possible deadly aggression towards humans, we do tend to get into a debate about how dangerous they actually are, and how previous beliefs about the dangers of wolves meant that they were hunted to the point of extinction in many places, and tragically so. In fact, where I live in Scotland and across the rest of the UK, wolves were indeed hunted to extinction here hundreds of years ago, though some talk about the possibility that they are still here, keeping away from us humans. We have to remember then that this case, the case of Peter Stump from Bavaria, is steeped in that time, a time of suspicion, a time of superstition, and a time when Europeans were still very much mired in a contest with the strength and intermittent brutality of Mother Nature. Wolves were seen as a real threat in certain communities, and we know from more recent cases, such as the Kirov wolf attacks, where as many as 22 children and teenagers were eaten by unusually aggressive and bold wolf packs between 1944 and 1954, that while wolf attacks are rare, they still can happen. Though we can't rule out mass hysteria and landowners being overzealous in their desire to protect cattle and other animals as explanations for why wolves were targeted, in any case, the 1500s were certainly filled with tales of slavering wolves hiding in the woods, waiting for an unsuspecting victim to pass by. And those stories have seeped into our collective consciousness in the form of movies, books, and of course, fairy tales. My, what big eyes you have. The backdrop then to this case and how it may have ended up the subject of a specific pamphlet from the late 1500s is key to uncovering the truth, if such a truth can be found, about the alleged werewolf murders of one Peter Stump. I'm going to draw heavily from a research paper written by Dana Wren, who published a piece on her website called The Execution of Werewolf Peter Stump, an Analysis, and I'll also be covering various elements from other translations of the original pamphlet. There'll be other websites as well that I've looked at along the way. Links to the sources can be found in the show notes below, and if you are fascinated by this case, those links are well worth your time. The case of Peter Stump was widely covered throughout Germany, and differing accounts of what actually happened exist. He was also referred to as Peter Stub, 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 and Stump, but we'll stick to Stump as his second name for reasons that will become apparent. The version we will be looking at most closely is the pamphlet printed in June of 1590 by Edward Venge in London. It was sold on Fleet Street and was translated from High Dutch. The translation is a little difficult to read in today's modern English. Here's an example. In reading of this story, therefore, I do first request reformation of opinion, next patience to peruse it because it is published for example's sake, and lastly to censure thereof as reason and wisdom doth think convenient, considering the subtlety that sateth... Can't even get through it. That Satan useth to work the soul's destruction, and the great matters which the accursed practice of sorcery doth affect, the fruits whereof is death, and well, you get the picture. It's pretty dense, but don't worry, I'm not going to read it word for word. I've done my best to summarise it. Here we go. Peter Stump's date of birth is difficult to pin down. Local records were destroyed many years ago in a fire, but most scholars claim that he was a farmer living during the mid-1500s in Bavaria, South Germany. The pamphlet states that in the town of Bedburg and some of the other surrounding towns and villages, Peter spent much of his youthful years. Even from an early age, those who knew him said he was captivated by evil thoughts and behaviours, and that between the ages of 12 and 20 he was practising witchcraft, or as it was written in the pamphlet, the wicked arts. That's wicked arts, not wicked arse. I just want to clear that up. Sometimes my pronunciation. Anyway, Peter was enthralled by the dark promises of malevolent magic, and he took to learning all he could about sorcery and even that forbidden practice of erasing the dead, known commonly as necromancy. As we've seen with accusations of witchcraft during such trials, Peter Stump is framed as a Satanist who sold his soul to the devil and betrayed God. The pamphlet interestingly mentions that Peter's motivations were to indulge his carnal desires for blood and violence, and also so that he would be famous and, quote, spoken of on earth, though he lost heaven thereby. It is suggested here that Peter Stump was asked by the devil about what he wanted in return for his soul, and that Peter asked that, quote, at his pleasure he might work his malice on men, women, and children in the shape of some beast, where he might live without dread or danger of life, and unknown to be the executor of any bloody enterprise which he meant to commit. So he was a coward, according to the pamphlet, and that he wanted to carry out horrendous acts of murder and cannibalism so that his name, as the Werewolf of Bedburg, would be well known, but that his human name would not, helping him avoid arrest and punishment. It's unnerving as well to hear about how he wanted to be famous, especially considering how, in the 21st century, some serial murderers, and especially school shooters, are often driven by the need to be known. It's quite horrible to think how long that need has been with humanity, the twisted desire to be infamous for terrible acts, rather than being happy to be unknown, yet living a worthwhile, benevolent life. Interestingly, in at least 2 other broadsheets published originally in Germany from Nuremberg and Augsburg, it was suggested that Peter used a cursed belt. This belt was the source of his shape-shifting powers. Some have suggested that it was given to him by the devil himself. When he wore it, Peter could transform himself into a ravenous wolf and attack the innocent without revealing his identity. This isn't as strange as it sounds. At least it wasn't during the 1500s. A part of werewolf folklore states that a special belt can be created to bestow the characteristics of the wolf. This is in line with many tribal traditions throughout the world, if you think about it, where wearing the skin of an animal bestows that animal's power on the wearer. I know there have also been rituals where people have bathed in the blood of certain animals in order to somehow gain that animal's power and ability to hunt or fight. The pamphlet states that the belt or girdle transformed him into the likeness of a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like unto brands of fire, a mouth great and wide, with most sharp and cruel teeth, a huge body, and mighty paws. Reading this text, it seems that the humanoid aspect of the werewolf legend, where the shapeshifter retains some of its human form, is a later addition to the mythology. Certainly here it seems as though Peter Stump is transforming into a large wolf, but one indistinct from the real thing. This would make sense considering that his pact with the devil specifically requested that his human form remain hidden. Peter Stump then began his alleged reign of terror. It was said that anyone who displeased or angered him would become a target. He would wait until they or one of their loved ones was alone in the fields or on a quiet street, adorn the belt, and then turn into the vicious wolf, which would tear out the throats of each victim and rip apart their arms, legs, and other joints. Peter was so taken with his own crimes that accounts claim he indulged in his bloodlust as much as possible. He would hide in remote areas and wait for random victims, whether it was day or night. The full moon didn't seem to matter in this case. It was said that Peter while he secretly murdered and ate countless victims, that he became a respected gentleman in many of the towns around Bedburg. He was known for his civility and kindness to those he met, and was also known as a good friend and someone who could be trusted. Shades of predatory molesters and killers here then, being so manipulative, but we'll get back to that. Peter Stump would secretly mock his victims by saluting and, it seems, consoling the families and friends of the dead. Now, there is a theory about Peter Stump being an early serial killer, and there is a line here in the pamphlet which, to my 21st century eyes, suggests this possibility. The pamphlet mentions that Peter would walk the streets and that if he saw a maid, wife or child he liked, he would, quote, in the fields ravish them and after in his wolfish likeness cruelly murder them, unquote. It makes no distinction between the adults and children here, but it does sound like he would sometimes first attack or even befriend people in his human form, first before getting them alone and then changing. This is where we get to the first mention of witnesses. It's claimed in the pamphlet that he would sometimes change into his wolf form and attack a group of maids in the fields who were relaxing or milking cows. While they all ran, he would target one and drag them away into the tall grass to devour them. You can imagine then that there were reports at the time of young women being eaten by a huge wolf prowling in the fields of parts of Bavaria. This became such a common sight that whispers spread, and before too long, most feared being alone or working in the fields. They truly feared what some were calling the beast of Bedburg. The beast preyed on local animals, including lambs and kids. I think that means young goats. Later, some suggested that Peter Stump was doing this so that no one would suspect the wolf was actually a human in disguise. By killing the animals, he was acting as they would have expected a real wolf to. With the mention again of livestock being affected, you wonder if rich landowners finally took notice when their animals were being taken and torn apart. As if a pact with the devil and murderer wasn't enough, Peter Stump also had a young daughter whom he allegedly lusted after, committing incest. He also was reported to have had an incestuous relationship with his own sister. Around this time, Peter entered into a relationship with a woman named Catherine Trompin. That's another great name in Talking Till Dawn's history. Trompin. Trompin about the fields. Sorry. Named Catherine Trompin. Say that again, just so you can enjoy it one more time. Catherine Trompin, who was described as being beautiful and well-liked. He treated her as an object for his own pleasure, and eventually he was unsatisfied with her. The devil offered Peter a wicked spirit that formed itself into the likeness of a woman, and one of the most beautiful on earth at that, and Peter experimented with this she-devil for 7 years. I wouldn't like to have been that she-devil. It was also said that Peter Stump had a son, and that his son was the most important person in his life. However, the bloodlust was growing within Peter, and eventually he desired the blood of his own child. He led his son, most probably a young man at this stage, to the forest, where he transformed into a wolf and killed him. He then, quote, ate the brains out of his head as a most savoury and dainty delicious mean to staunch his greedy appetite, the most monstrous act that ever man heard of, for never was known a wretch from nature so far degenerate, unquote. In another instance, Peter hid, watching 2 men and a woman pass by. He knew one of them by name and so shouted on the man. When the man investigated by himself, Peter killed him. Then, when the second man went looking for his friend, he was dispatched too. Finally, Peter chased down the woman and, quote, deflowered her, unquote, another suggestion here of rape and molestation, and then ate every part of her. This is the only victim in the pamphlet that it mentions how the victim was completely consumed. There is also a suggestion in one paragraph of possible bestiality with other animals. It's not overtly spoken of, perhaps that topic was beyond the pale for the publication, but I definitely feel it's implied when the pamphlet talks about attacks on animals and then, quote, did act more mischief and cruelty than would be credible, unquote. It goes on to say that the true victim count remains unknown, as Peter tended to find either a person or an animal to slay each and every day. Panic grew throughout Bedburg and the surrounding areas, as those living there knew that at any moment they could be taken by the beast. Many refused to travel out with the safety of their homes, and when they did, they invariably encountered bits of arms and legs scattered in fields and lonely forest trails from the men, women, and children that Peter killed. If you have listened to our Paisley Witches episodes, you'll remember that in that case, the presence of God, or at the very least, faith in God, was seen as a powerful force that eventually was able to turn the tide against the alleged witchcraft at play. During the Beast of Bedburg case, it was claimed that the power of the Christian God did not abandon those afflicted by fear and panic. The pamphlet describes how, on one sunny day, a group of children were playing in a meadow near some cows with their young. Suddenly, the wolf appeared from the tall grass and leaped forward, snatching one of the children, a small girl. However, while the wolf dragged the child across the ground, it was unable to pierce her throat because of the thickness of the coat she was wearing that had a high collar. While the wolf thrust its fangs with ever greater strength, desperately trying to reach the girl's neck, the screams from the children frightened the cows. Then, as though they were either divinely inspired to react, or because they were protecting their calves, the cows stampeded towards the wolf, driving it back off into the nearby woodland. The pamphlet attributes this to an act of God. Holy cow. Local communities now rallied together, and in good old-fashioned pitchfork gumption, they set out to entrap the Beast of Bedburg. Many used large dogs, some of them mastiffs, to hunt the wolf down. They set out across the countryside and then through the streets and fields of Bedburg, when finally they laid eyes upon the beast. The wolf was ferocious, but it was outnumbered and tried to flee. This time, assisted by their dogs, the people of those local communities, so long afflicted by the countless deaths and murders allegedly perpetrated by the wolf, were only moments away from capturing their enemy. In a last act of desperation, Peter Stump slipped the belt off of him, turning spontaneously into a human. When the hunters caught up with him, they at first knew him to be a man who was well respected in the community. But Peter Stump's luck had finally run out. Some had seen his miraculous transformation, and, without the belt now in his possession, Peter Stump had no way to escape. He was arrested. All he had in his hand was a walking stick. Before we get into the nitty-gritty and deeply disturbing details that followed his capture, there is one part of the Peter Stump legend that I want to address. As I mentioned earlier, the few records that exist between the pamphlet in England and the broadsheet reports in Germany, Peter's second name was sometimes Stub or Stump. One theory as to why he was called Stump is that, in one account, one of the wolf's paws was cut off during the chase. When Peter Stump transformed back into human form, he was missing a hand. That was what condemned him. So his name might not have been Stump, or Stub, or Stub, or Stump, but that might have been a nickname, because one of his hands was missing, and all he had in its place was a stump of flesh at the wrist. I should say that this is a common part of werewolf folklore, and it's often how someone is recognised as being one. Even in more modern tales like Stephen King's The Silver Bullet, someone is revealed to be a werewolf because of a wound they have. In any case, The London pamphlet doesn't mention this detail, so it's possible that this was an inaccurate edition at some point in mainland Europe. Now, we're going to go over the final accounts of what happened to Peter Stump after he was arrested, and the details are grisly and disturbing, so you have been warned. The pamphlet mentions that he was racked, meaning that he was placed onto a torture device that was designed to pull your arms and legs until they dislocated, broke, and in some instances tore clean off. Here the depiction of Stump as a coward is reinforced as he breaks before he's even put on it and confesses. In other sources he is tortured and then confesses to being a werewolf. To be fair, I think the sight of a rack, just the sight of it, Iraq, not Iraq the country, Iraq, would be enough to make me confess to things I hadn't done, and that's kind of the point, isn't it? His confession included a full account of how he used sorcery to meet with the devil, and how he received the girdle or belt that allowed him to transform. When Peter told the magistrate who was investigating the crimes about the belt, he was asked where he had taken it off during the pursuit, but when someone was sent there to recover it, there was no sign of it. The pamphlet suggests this is because the devil must have retrieved it, or, it was never actually there in the first place. Of course, we could always speculate that someone got their hands on it and were tempted by its powers. The belt of power. It's like the ring of power, but it's a belt. Never mind. After this admission, Peter Stump was imprisoned. The magistrates continued to investigate the matter and concluded that Peter's daughter, Stubbe, and the woman he had had an affair with, Catherine Trompin, were accessories to the crimes. On the 28th of October, 1589, it was decided that Peter, Catherine, and Peter's daughter should suffer a terrible fate for their alleged crimes. 3 days later, on Halloween, Peter Stump was laid on a wheel, and red-hot pincers were used to pluck pieces of his skin and flesh from his body while he was still alive. In 10 different places, the skin, fat, and the muscle was torn off from the bone. His legs and arms were then broken with a wooden axe. Finally, still alive, his head was cut from his body and his carcass was burned to ashes. Both Catherine and Beale, the daughter, were burned to death while Peter was being executed. The pamphlet says that all of this was carried out in front of many peers and princes of Germany. It seems that torture and murder were to be their entertainment. In the end, when the fires relented, Peter Stump's head was placed on a pole alongside a wooden likeness of a wolf. This was to be a warning to any others who were tempted to delve into witchcraft. 16 pieces of wood were placed around the head to represent the 16 murders attributed directly to Peter, though some believed that there were many more. And so, that is the terrible tale of Peter Stump, the werewolf of Bedburg. What are we to make of it? Well, it's hard not to look at this document as the exaggerated product of the same hysteria that led to thousands of women being murdered for alleged witchcraft. It's possible, of course, that Peter was indeed involved with such things, but the description of how he was caught makes you wonder if he was simply walking by at the wrong time in the wrong place, as the hunters were on the trail of a large wolf. They bumped into him, and then one of the hunters accuses him of being a werewolf, as you do. In the description of when he's apprehended, it says that he was carrying a walking stick, which lends credence to the idea that he was, out for a walk when they stumbled upon him. Then the torture or the threat of it only made him confess. It's terrifying to think that such a thing could happen, but it did, time and time again. Even one of the other so-called conspirators, Catherine Trompin, she was mentioned in the pamphlet as being a gossip. It's possible that she was the victim of people who despised her within the community, or they had a grudge. Often in these sorts of cases of alleged witchcraft or sorcery, those who are accused are simply different, or they keep themselves to themselves and stories spread about what they are doing. That could have been enough to have you labelled a warlock or witch or even a werewolf. Peter's daughter being executed as well is just heartbreaking. There's no idea I detest more than the sins of the father. Throughout history, children have been tarred with the crimes of their parents, growing up under a tainted shadow that they do not deserve. Whenever I hear about this type of murder, state-sanctioned execution of someone for simply being a relation, it sickens me. Let's say we are not dealing with a werewolf case, but instead another form of witch trial. What about the murders then? If they happened, how can they be accounted for? It's been suggested that either Peter Stump or someone else who was never caught was an early serial killer operating in Bedburg and the surrounding areas. I mentioned this possibility earlier. In fact, his execution was so horrific that it almost suggests vengeance. Some have suggested that the werewolf accusations were attributed to him just so they could get him on Witchcraft, because the local community suspected him of being a killer without actual proof. Then there is the possibility that very real wolf attacks were occurring and that over time, the local communities turned to superstition to explain them. Peter and the others could have been an excuse to set those fears to rest. There is also the possibility that everything has been exaggerated, including the execution, but it's difficult to tell. Records that would have at least recorded some of these events in greater detail, including Peter's full identity, were destroyed in a fire long ago. I always say that I leave the door open for the possibility of a paranormal explanation. The door remains open here, but only just. It's far more likely that this was another example of brutal state execution. I try my best to avoid politics as much as possible on the podcast, and I can absolutely understand why some won't agree with this, but in my view, no state should have the power to put people to death, even if their crimes are hideous to us. What I hope to be true is that the tale was simply made up for the news cycle of the day. But this story has survived so long that it probably has some basis in reality. Whether that reality has room for shape-shifting humans, who knows? You might think we're done, but I have some more things to share with you. While researching the Peter Stump case, I came across some other pieces that I thought might interest you. Things werewolf related, and specifically connected to stories like Peter Stump's that infer another possible explanation for all of this. Cannibalism. After all, it's not unheard of for humans to start eating each other when there isn't access to food. Could that have been what Peter Stump was really doing? It's mentioned that he ate several of his victims, including one woman in her entirety. In fact, looking at records, you can find that there were pan-European famines occurring across the European continent between the 1560s and 1590s. Many of these affected Bavaria and Germany too. Is it possible then that this isn't a story of werewolves and witchcraft, but of actual serial cannibalism? Could it have been such a problem in the area that Peter Stump was made an example of in the most awful way as a deterrent? Unless more records come to light, we probably won't ever answer those questions. It does occur to me that cannibalism, shape-shifting, these ideas become intertwined and appear in folklore around the world. And I do think about people talking about the Wendigo in Native American folklore, where cannibalism is sometimes used as the avenue through which a person becomes the hideous Wendigo. But anyway, what's also interesting to me is that throughout Europe, the folklore surrounding vampirism, witchcraft and werewolfery are often intertwined as well. It can be difficult to separate all of these cases from each other. However, there is one aspect that seems to bind them, as I said, and that is the act of cannibalism. Is that a coincidence? I found a disturbing article in the Kansas State Record newspaper from March 13th, 1870, where the connection between some of these claims are discussed in gory detail, and cannibalism as a possible explanation for these claims is central to its outlaying of horrendous historical cases throughout Europe. I'll read from it now, though I should say that the archived version of this article, being so old, was difficult to read in places. I've done my best to decipher the text as much as possible for you. Okay, here we go. Quote, "Vampires and infanticide, civilized cannibals, a child eaten, thirsting for human blood, ghouls and vampires, the berserkers of Scandinavia, werewolves, infanticide." I don't know why they put infanticide twice. In newspaper speak, that's called the blurb paragraph. It's supposed to sum up what's in the article. It's a wild one. Anyway, the article continues. In the year 1779, a Frenchman named Farage, not Nigel Farage, said we wouldn't get political, under the influence of cannibalism, suddenly left his companions and surrendered himself to this horrible propensity. He selected as his retreat a cavern near the top of one of the mountains of Or, whence he used to descend like a beast of prey into the Champagne country, killing all the women. He could eat nothing else and was constantly seen to gaze as if in wait for an opportunity to seize his prey. He never went abroad without a double-barrelled gun, a belt full of pistols, and a dagger. So great was the terror that he inspired that he used frequently to come into towns for food or ammunition without any molestation. A peasant whom he suspected of a design upon him had his house burned over his head. He used to decoy any muleteers he chanced to discover in the woods to his den, where they were uniformly murdered. A large reward was offered for his capture, in vain, until a bold peasant insinuated himself into his confidence and captured him. This beast of prey, for such he was executed on the 12th of December 1792. He was broken alive on the wheel. For 4 years he had lived exclusively as a cannibal. There's that punishment again on the wheel. Similar. And I wonder if that's connected again to Peter Stump and why he was treated so badly. Could it have been that that was, as far as the public saw, his greatest crime, that he was a cannibal? You do wonder if werewolf became synonymous with cannibalism in the eyes of Europeans at the time. And much like how alleged witches were killed because of breaking, in society's eyes, the great taboo of conspiring with the devil himself, that accused werewolves were also executed so brutally because they were seen as having broken another of society's great taboos, to eat human flesh. The article continues, during the 15th and 16th centuries, cannibalism frequently manifested itself among those supposed to be civilized. On the 14th of December 1599, the Parliament of Paris sentenced a tailor named Chalons to be burned alive for lycanthropy. The evidence showed that he had decoyed children into his shop or attacked them when they strayed from home, and having torn them with his teeth and killed them, he dressed them as ordinary meat and devoured them with great relish. A whole cask full of bones was discovered in his house. As an aside here, I don't know if this case took place in December, but given the expediency of such trials, I would imagine that some of the killings happened around winter time. You can't help but draw a connection between the prevalence of alleged werewolf attacks, the act of cannibalism, and how cannibalism often reared its hideous head when people were starving. In the winter, that's when food is in shorter supply. The article now mentions another case. In 1440, Marechand de Retz, a marshal of France, probably butchered that pronunciation, sorry everyone, a scholarly man, a patriot, and a man of holy life, became suddenly possessed by an uncontrollable desire to murder children. During 7 years he continued to inveigle little girls and boys into his castle at the rate of about 10 a week, and then put them to death in various ways. that he might witness their agony and bathe in their blood, experiencing after each occasion the most dreadful remorse, but led on by an irresistible craving to repeat the crime. When this unparalleled iniquity was finally brought to light, his castle was found to contain bins full of children's bones. It's just the stuff of nightmares. You wonder if there's yet another aspect of folklore entering into things here. When the article mentions possession, bear in mind this article was written in 1870, 27 years before Dracula was published and 60 years before Universal Studios put out their first werewolf film, The Werewolf of London. Of course, it could simply be a turn of phrase, and it probably is the way it was written, but I think we can see the beginnings of the werewolf as a human taken control of, possessed by something, rather than someone willingly murdering people. And then the killer becomes a sort of victim as well, a tragic figure. The article goes on to say, quote, "Not long since, a young girl 11 years of age who lived in Paris attempted to murder her mother, sister, and many of her playmates for the purpose of drinking their blood. After a careful examination by a scientific man, it was declared that she was subject to the strange and terrible mania of cannibalism. As she was extremely young, this strange perversion of natural instincts afforded a prospect of cure. In 1694, a Hungarian countess named Elizabeth, I'm assuming this is the very famous case of Elizabeth Bathory, enticed young girls into her palace on various pretexts, and then coolly murdered them for the purpose of bathing in their blood. The spectacle of human suffering at last became such a delight to her that she would apply with her own hands the most excruciating tortures, keenly relishing the shrieks of her victims. In this way, she is said to have murdered 60 persons before her career was brought to an end." And here's another case. A sergeant in France a few years ago used at midnight to leave his quarters and dig up bodies in Père Lachaise, which he subsequently devoured. The unfortunate man is now cured and is but 32 years of age. He preserves of the episodes of his past life only a confused memory, like the recollections of a painful dream. In olden times, science feared to approach these sufferers. So that seems to be two instances here where they're saying that people were cured of their cannibalistic tendencies. You wonder if that was actually true, or if the original accusations were exaggerated, or indeed if in some instances it's someone being incredibly manipulative and knowing that the only way they can get out of this situation is to pretend to be cured. We've got some problematic language here, folks, that's coming up, but never mind, we'll push on through it as best we can. A Hindu named Ramadan was recently tried in northern India on a terrible charge. The number of victims of this man-eater is thus far unknown. He has, however, killed 27 in a year and a half, and displayed an especial taste for men that called themselves holy when on pilgrimages. A hungry atheist. No, that's a terrible joke. In actuality, reading that passage, it's interesting because that's kind of really talking about a case where someone has maybe even a profile that you could apply to it, long before people talked about that sort of thing, where someone has a type of victim and also someone who may have a psychological, not valid reason, but a psychological motivation for killing, and maybe there's a reason why they've picked especially religious people. The article goes on, in 1869 a beggar in Palomilla, Galicia was proved to have killed and eaten 14 children. The old berserkers of Scandinavia killed human beings for mere gratification. Their chief amusement and business was to set sail for some pleasant country like Spain or France, and make all the coasts and navigable rivers hideous with rapine and massacre. When at home, in the intervals between their freelooting expeditions, they were liable to become possessed, there's that word again, by a strange homicidal madness, during which they would array themselves in wolf skins and sally forth by night, to snap the backbones, smash the skulls, and sometimes to drink with fiendish glee the blood of unwary travellers and loiterers. The peasantry of many secluded portions of Europe still cherish the superstition of the Middle Ages concerning werewolves. A werewolf was a person who had the power of transforming himself into a wolf, being endowed while in this lupine state with the intelligence of a man, the ferocity of a wolf, and the irresistible strength of a demon. I'll stop there for a moment. This last passage is interesting, isn't it? First of all, there's the suggestion here that older mythology surrounding werewolves involves retaining the intelligence of a human being. That's quite different from some of the later depictions of werewolves, where the afflicted is a victim and their intelligence is torn away from them, replaced by the impulsive bloodlust of a ferocious animal. What makes later stories of werewolfery so frightening is that once bitten, the person has no intellectual control over what happens next. Hence why the heroes in werewolf movies tend to have to chain themselves up to stop themselves from hurting those nearby. We also have the mentioned strength of a demon. Again, this for me alludes to the blurring of lines between werewolf folklore and witchcraft, even Satanism or the occult. These stories seem to feed on each other like proverbial wolves themselves. The article is nearly finished, but we'll keep going as I think it's a fascinating read. I was really glad that I found it. Skin changers was another name for these mythical beings. According to the medieval theory, while the werewolf kept the human form, his hair grew inward. When he wished to become a wolf, he merely turned himself inside out. That sounds like someone put on the spot to provide an explanation of how any of this is possible. And how exactly can a man change into a wolf? He hides his hair on the inside. It's all tangled up out there, and when no one's looking, Bob's your uncle. Out pops all the hair and teeth. Anyway, sorry. According to another theory, the person possessed had merely to put on a wolf skin in order to assume instantly the lupine form and character. Now that's fascinating. It's been a common practice throughout human history for humans to wear animal skins, like I mentioned before, for warmth, ritual purposes, and even protection during a battle. You wonder if some of the werewolf stories come directly from that, people particularly vicious while wearing the skin of a wolf. Anyway, the article continues. The inhuman practice of the Caribs was to salt their children and devour them with keen relish. Not the kind you put on burgers, mind. Again, this is 1870, so you can't expect this article to handle everything evenly. Some might think the article is referring to the Kalina, who are sometimes referred to as Caribs, an indigenous people native to South America. However, it's more likely here that the writer is referring to the Kalinago or island Caribs, who lived in island communities off of South America around the time of the Spanish conquistadors. It's been suggested that they practiced cannibalism, by some at least. Today they live in the Lesser Antilles and find the accusations of cannibalism to be offensive. However, there is evidence of cannibalism centuries ago and roasting of human beings, not in the comedy club kind of way. During times of war in that part of the world, these things definitely occurred. In 1864, a man named Balthazar Casa was committed to the flames in Suabia for the inhuman and horrible practice of digging up bodies from the graves and eating them with a fiendish relish. Not sure if this time fiendish relish is an actual branded condiment. Here we go again. The crime of infanticide, or the slaughter of young children to repress too numerous a population, was not only sanctioned by the customs of the ancient world, but was recommended by its sages and even enacted by its legislators. Thus Plato and Aristotle both enjoined the practice, and Lycurgus made it part of the law of Sparta. In the Roman world, during the reign of Caligula, it was common. In more modern times, the Hottentots buried their children alive, and even at this day, there are immense numbers of infants exposed every year to death on the streets of Peking, and in Bombay, India, female infanticide prevails to such an extent that sometimes 1,000 little female innocents have suffered in 1 year, the shocking act being generally performed by suffocating them in milk. At the annual sacrifices in Peru, before they were civilized, 200 children were devoted to the health of the Inca and sacrificed. Grim reading. I'm sure you'll agree, even though the article obviously has terrible bias and more than a whiff of stereotypes about it, there's still some interesting stuff in there, and I think we can directly connect some of it to the likes of Peter Stump and other werewolf cases throughout Europe and beyond. We're not quite done yet. Just before you go, if you have the time, and don't mind me prattling on, during my research for the Stump case, I was looking through some other newspaper archives and I found a few interesting pieces. One in particular captured my imagination. It was only a couple of paragraphs in a newspaper called the Courier News. This item was published May 20th, 1943. It reads as follows. Savants, it ain't so. Ends werewolf case. Palo Alto, California. Something big, black and hairy that walks upright but does not have a face has been frightening early risers. Deputy sheriffs investigated a barrage of such reports, but it remained for Professor Ira L. Wiggins, director of the Stanford Natural History Museum, to settle the werewolf hysteria. He announced officially that there just isn't any such animal. And that's the end of that article. Sounds like a rigorous investigation. I know it's a very old article and the professor probably said a lot more than was printed, but while I try to keep a critical eye on claims, even when they sound outlandish, just saying that something doesn't exist because there is no replicable evidence for it yet, I always find that argument to be flimsy at best and unhelpful. In any case, while I get off my soapbox for a moment, the description of something walking around without a face really piqued my interest, and I hope it's a case I can find more on and bring to you soon. It sounds like it could have been a case of mass hysteria, could have been one of these instances where local communities, there's an urban legend and people kind of consume that and are frightened by it, and I just bash my hand off something, but ignore that. I think that story sounds fascinating, but look, I think we have to draw a line under all of this for now. Probably going on a bit too much. I think the night is waning here and the sun is rising. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you have, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you will get early access to episodes and a bunch of bonus content, and of course, the warm, fuzzy feeling inside that you're helping keep the show alive. The world's a strange place, and there are so many weird and frightening cases for us to delve into. The world is filled with mystery and we can explore it. So I hope you'll come with me on those adventures as we watch the stars give way to the morning sun and keep talking till dawn. Thanks for spending the time with me.